Hello, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning, I guess, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Emily Spranger. I'm an academic trainer from the Center of Teaching and Learning. And I'm very happy to be here with our panelists today for our third VESC Ed Breaks Series, Cultural Trauma and Cross-Generational Inequities, Strategies for Developing Awareness and Empathy, with one of our very own instructional design editors, Christy Sholola. And she'll be presenting in just a few moments. I did want to make everyone aware that Dr. Amy Lynn is also on this call with us today. A couple of housekeeping things. We have the webinar is being recorded and we'll be posting in our CTL webinar section for your viewing pleasure for later. The chat is open, so please feel free to have dialogue in there, ask questions in there. The only thing is when you use the chat, if you want everybody to see what you're posting, please make sure to select all attendees and, in the drop-down function of the chat, and ask any questions that you'd like in the Q&A, and we will get to those as time permits. So thank you again for joining us. I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Amy Lynn for a few brief words.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's been really exciting to roll these out on behalf of VESC. And I just wanted to say, I've had the pleasure of working with Christy behind the scenes in course development. And it is just such an honor to be able to work with her and to be able to collaborate with her. She is so open and so thoughtful. I really think you're going to love her presentation today. So enjoy.
Thank you, Dr. Lynn. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Different is Not Deficient, creating paths to empathy and awareness by utilizing equity-minded frameworks to develop culturally responsive curriculum. So as part of the IDE team, I conduct substantive copy editing of the course content to ensure that it reflects NCU's editorial standards, while also examining the content from students' perspectives to ensure the content reflects diversity, equity, inclusion in terms of students' lived experiences. There are diverse viewpoints, inclusive language, and tone that acknowledges and respects the diverse student populations that we serve. So of course, when I'm editing course content, I don't edit the content within a vacuum. My goal is to review it with the understanding that course content will be read and absorbed through the lens of a diverse student population with multiple lived experiences that reflect their intense awareness and impact of current events, historical occurrences, recent tragedies, et cetera. So this afternoon, I want to share that awareness and some strategies with you. It's not an exhaustive list, but hopefully it'll be something that will benefit you. So before I offer those strategies, I want to offer you a visual of how those individual concepts can be approached within the context of students' lived experiences and how you can effectively develop and deliver course content that will ultimately help students to see themselves and glimpses of their experiences within the curriculum. So these are all the different components, and we'll be discussing those from this point on. So in this particular Venn diagram, it illustrates how these elements meet up, how they can ideally be embedded within each other. These elements, student lived experiences, empathy, cultural awareness, course curriculum, and the equity-minded frameworks must be intentionally addressed and considered before and during the course development and review process, instead of addressing these matters as an afterthought when the course has been completed. One of those elements is cultural awareness, which is the ability and willingness to objectively examine the values, beliefs, traditions, and perceptions within your own and other cultures. At the most basic level, it is the ability to walk in someone else's shoes in terms of origins, which leads us to the definition of empathy. Empathy is the ability to step into the shoes of another person, aiming to understand their feelings and perspectives, and to use that understanding to guide our actions. It is essentially viewing an experience of the world from another person's perspective. And I know some may wonder why empathy is discussed as opposed to tolerance, which is something you probably hear more within the educational environment. Well, tolerance can be a great first step toward understanding and acceptance, but the act of tolerance tends to hinge upon a person's ability or willingness to tolerate or to accept some individuals and their communities or people who are different for them, or communities are different from them. But if there is an inability or an unwillingness to consistently do this, then that can be problematic. So as you can see in this graphic, if there's a shift in the tolerance, that can sometimes perpetuate what is called otherism, or depicted in this illustration, a them versus us attitude or environment, where the condition of this tolerance or putting up with someone or something different appears to have a definitive expiration date. Otherism is simply the conscious and willful separation between groups of people based on characteristics. So to get past that them versus us otherism, we must work to infuse empathy, but it must be more than just a response. To ensure its deep impact, there must be first a relationship of trust, one that informs students and that they are important to their instructors. According to Dr. Goyak in the January 2021 Faculty Focus magazine, it is the realization that our course is more than mere content. Rather, it is a platform on which to model life skills that are woefully lacking in our society: empathy, pity, concern, and grace. Empathy is not just a desire to help, it is a responsive action. So what does this course of action, responsive action look like? How do we develop empathy into our course content, particularly when our online virtual classroom? Empathy can be taught even within an online class. So as you develop or design courses, update content, and facilitate current classes, consider using these strategies to promote or incorporate empathy into the course content. By doing so, your virtual presence either reveals that you care, that your students succeed, or you don't. So some online educators have noted that it's possible for you to hold your students accountable for their work while also doing so with empathy. They noted that if you owe it to students to read between the lines of their emails, that they owe it to their students to ask questions of care and concern when they see trigger words that speak to their grief, frustration, or sadness. They also said they owe it to their students to teach them more than just what is in their syllabus. They owe it to them to enter their story and see their students' circumstances through a lens which is not their own. So these strategies include model empathy, provide ample outlets for guided interpersonal communication among students, incentivize positive student-to-student interactions, build self and peer reflection into the assignments, design tasks using experiential learning techniques, plan projects that promote a sense of community, develop a user-centric course to help build empathetic learners, conduct surveys frequently to learn more about students, express vulnerability by asking students for their feedback, transform empathy into a skill that empowers students. And now that we have these strategies to promote empathy in our virtual online courses, let's now discuss some of the challenges that students face in the areas which educators need to offer them assistance. Cultural trauma occurs when members of a collectivity feel that they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. Examples of cultural trauma include slavery in the US and the vestiges of slavery, the Holocaust, Native American internment camps, Japanese internment camps, September 11th, and the separation of migrant children from their families at the southern border. Then there is generational or intergenerational trauma, which results from exposure to chronic or extreme mental or physical stress. Unfortunately, it is common to the human experience and has the power to spread across people and time. According to researchers, if nothing is done to mitigate the influence of traumatic experiences, individuals afflicted by today's challenges may pass their trauma on to next generations. Therefore, it's critically important to recognize the impact of trauma on our students, because the way that it affects them can emerge across as generational. It can come across and affect them through generational inequities. And unfortunately, this current pandemic has revealed a stark connection between the cultural generational traumas experienced by many people of color and the systemic inequities that they encounter. And they may come in the form of educational inequities, healthcare inequities, environmental inequities, housing inequities, racial inequities within the criminal justice system, and interaction with law force. And of course, the list goes on and on. So trauma-informed pedagogy requires educators, instructors to have a keen awareness of the students' past and present experiences and effects of those experiences on students' well-being. While this approach is not calling for you to become a mental health expert or therapist, it helps you to become or want to learn more about students. It will help from that approach to recognize trauma within our own lived experiences and within the lived experiences of our students to help them feel safe, empowered, and connected. And some of those principles are listed here. They include work to ensure your students emotional, cognitive, physical, and interpersonal safety, foster trustworthiness and transparency through connection and communication among students, intentionally facilitate peer support and mutual self-help in courses, promote collaboration and mutuality by sharing power and decision-making with your students, empower voice and choice by identifying and helping to build on students' strengths, focus on cultural, historical, and gender issues, and finally, impart to your students the importance of having a sense of purpose. All of these principles lead to the concept of incorporating culturally responsive teaching concepts. While our educational environment is virtual, it is important to remember that our students do not just live online. So this concept is important. There are several definitions here that read, being culturally responsive, a critical necessary feature of our interactions with one another. And culture responsive teaching requires instructors to adopt a framework of teaching and way of understanding who students are so that they can be celebrated, affirmed, and empowered to advocate for one another. And here are the essential strategies to help create the culture responsive learning environment. And they include know your students, learn about them, and that is important to the curriculum that you're developing. Be aware of your own personal biases to make sure that that does not become embedded in your content. Transform your pedagogy and curriculum. Be sure your course content, materials, and reading reflects the diversity in the students that are in your class and the individuals contributing to the field of knowledge. Respect and reinforce student culture. By valuing each student's culture, we contribute to their self-concept, which in turn influences their academic success. And finally, involve family and community. This is important because many assignments can sometimes be a way to shed light on a person's individual experiences in terms of what is important to them in terms of their family by asking. You can utilize questionnaires and things of that sort. Our next element focuses on equity-minded frameworks. Equity provides support to help students achieve success based on their individual needs, as illustrated in this graphic. While equality is based on the assumption that everyone benefits from receiving the same support, this is considered as equal treatment, which is not based on needs. So given this huge distinction between equity and equality, equity-minded frameworks are needed to address educational realities that include patterns of inequitable student outcomes. Within these equity-minded approaches, the practitioners are willing to take personal and institutional responsibility for the success of their students and critically assess their own practices, which require that practitioners are conscious of the inequities that occur based on race, socioeconomics, and gender. And most importantly, they acknowledge the social and historical context of exclusionary educational practices. The next few slides will talk about different frameworks. The first one is equity meets design. It is a practice that merges the consciousness of racial equity with the work of methodology of design thinking. The goal is to design for the most affected and marginalized, letting their voices and experiences lead, and acknowledging the barriers to engagement are critical for equity-minded approaches. The next one is targeted universalism. It is a framework that works to repair social cleavages, not just distribution. It focuses on the way particular groups and people traditionally excluded from decision-making must be included in the process of designing, implementing, and leading targeted universalism. UDL, or Universal Design Learning, focuses on usability, design, access, and inclusion as a way of addressing equity. UDL is a framework for designing learning experiences so students have options for how they learn, what materials they use, and how they demonstrate their learning. When implemented with the lens of equity, the framework can potentially eliminate opportunity gaps that exclude many learners, especially those who have been historically marginalized. Then, of course, there's the Bank's multicultural approach. It identifies 5 dimensions of multicultural education: content integration, knowledge construction, prejudice reduction, equitable pedagogy, and empowering school culture to facilitate the process of conceptualization and implementation of multicultural education. These dimensions are intended to build upon each other and can be leveled throughout a program curriculum. Regardless of which equity-minded approach you choose, the goal is that our course development process at every stage should thoughtfully and deliberately address and infuse cultural awareness, empathy, and the core concepts of the equity-minded framework at the early phases of course development and throughout, instead of ushering those concepts in as afterthoughts at the tail end of the process. This type of effort ensures the curriculum has the capacity to broaden perspectives, increase student engagement, all by recognizing diverse cultures and lived experiences and reducing bias, enabling students to see themselves and their experiences within course content. The next few slides I will show you are part of my everyday work in terms of when I receive content and how I take it from the original to the revised portion. So in this particular one, and I'm utilizing all the steps that I just mentioned to you in terms of identifying empathy and cultural responsiveness. So in this particular one, it talks about the case of a father who was raised in a home where physical abuse of spouse and children was common. And so the problem here is, as you'll note, is gender-based, and abuse can occur among anyone. So by changing it to say that you talk about a parent and you're approaching it from a totally different perspective, because abuse can occur among all individuals, and it's a better approach of revising from the perspective of a parent without even identifying an individual's gender. Because honestly, gender is not relevant to the partner who's being abused or the children who are witnessing the abuse. The next one. In this particular example, the originally written content dismisses many students' lived experiences. It ignores the reality by saying that it is incorrect when people think that police are trained to eliminate the immediate threat. You're talking about somebody's perception being incorrect, which is a fallacy in of itself. So it ignores the realities of people like Eric Gardner, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Alton Sterling, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Those are all horrific deaths that occurred at the hands of law enforcement. So in the revised content, the goal is to revise it with a more balanced and more culturally responsive, empathetic, and realistic revision. And the next one, the original content, the Civil Rights Act is referred to erroneously as a discriminatory practice. This is clearly wording that is not culturally responsive and one that dismisses, again, the views of a diverse student population. In the revised content, I address those concerns by referring to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a remedy to address past inequities. In the next slide, this one focuses on equitable treatment, or should focus on equitable treatment in the workplace environment, but the approach is slightly off because it wants to highlight gender differences and have training based on separating people based on their different characteristics. So instead of doing that, we want to have, again, a more balanced approach because it's beneficial to all employees to have all the training dealing with different individuals. Okay, and the next one, the last one that I have here, the last example, it focuses on individuals, and you should never refer to a person's humanity as being illegal. So that was something that I addressed in the next one, instead of focusing on an individual, because I always want to be more person-centered and not do harm to people if they're reading. You don't know people's individual experiences, but to me, it just lacks humanity to refer to anyone as illegal. And this revised content, we focus on the policy and not on the individual, as you can see there. I also took the time to include the SME checklist. It's an example. And this checklist came about as a result of work with the UDC and ID team back in 2018. We're trying to find ways to introduce all those concepts that I introduced here into something perhaps that the SMEs could use or faculty could use when they're developing course content, because the goal, again, is to embrace it at the beginning and not at the end. So this basically includes all the different areas that I mentioned to you during the course of this presentation, such as consider students' cultural context, reflecting your own biases, ensure language is inclusive and bias-free, does the content represent different viewpoints? Do you utilize an equity-minded framework? And the second portion of the checklist, are you delivering activities in a multiple format? And that has to do with more or less, are you utilizing different forms of content, video, text, are using graphic images that reflect diverse populations, viewpoints, and lifestyles, and so on. And I will end it with some of my favorite quotes here that I came across during this research. The first one is from Dr. Melissa Vandenbout in an article entitled "Diversity is a Foundational Value and Not an Added Value." She notes that rather than expecting such differences to pose a threat to unity, we could begin by thinking of our distinctive experiences as so many supplies to sustain us on a journey. Because we are so different, we each have something to offer that no one else can. And then there is this 1963 quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that remains relevant today. "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all." So I thank you. So Q&A time.
Yes, thank you so much, Christy.
You're welcome.
There's quite a bit of question here. Let's see. I'm going to start with what I have in the Q&A.
Okay.
So one of the first questions in the Q&A is from Therese. Therese asks, "Is this practice just one of NCU SOEs? Is this the practice of NCU SOEs or across all School of Education programs?"
Is the person referring to the editing process?
Yes, hold on one second. Therese, if I were to allow you to speak, would you be able to expand on that? I'm gonna see if you can talk. Are you able to unmute yourself, Therese?
Hello.
Hi.
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 Thank you, Emily. This was a great presentation. I asked because I was in a different ed leadership program on a graduate level and took a social emotional learning course, and none of this content came up. So my question is this is a practice or guidelines or principles that North Central University is teaching educational leaders, or is this something being proposed across the board for all educational leader School of Education programs?
So, sorry, I just want to expand just a little bit.
Okay.
I think she's mentioning is
Mhm.
the practice for just the School of
Okay.
Education all
Education.
the way across the board, or
Mhm.
specifically for the educational leadership specializations, my guess.
Okay. Okay, that's a great question. The information I presented to you today, I wanted to present that as a way of saying that this is information that I use, and I think that it should be used across all schools. I edit content for every discipline. So I edit across the board, whether it's education, psychology courses, the technical courses, dealing with AI, artificial intelligence. So the content that I edit is across the board. And so even though it's across the board, and education courses too, of course, so the issues that I'm talking about can pop up anywhere. So that's why I'm presenting it from the standpoint of an editor. But I think it should be embraced throughout all the programs because it's something that can pop up anywhere. I recently had a tech course that, the course of reading, I didn't see anything, and it was based on, I can't remember the name of the course, but it was mentioning different programs that are out there. But it didn't mention how some of the programs can have bias, and which makes sense because they're being created by humans. But the bias becomes an area of concern when you have programs that are being developed. For example, I remember seeing recently there was software being developed to identify people that may have been convicted of crime. Well, when it came to people of color, there was some bias involved. So unless you teach that to students, how would they know about it? How would they know that they're affected by it? Or the students that are in the class that have been affected by it, they may wonder, why aren't you mentioning it? So that's why I approach it from this standpoint of both cultural responsiveness and empathy, because if you're writing course content, it needs to address students' lived experiences.
And thank you so much, Christy. There's one more add-on to this last round of questions.
Okay.
But will trauma pedagogy guidelines be included in instructional standards for K? It says K through 20 on this question. But I don't know if that's all.
That's not my wheelhouse. So
that
might be a question for the education team. But I think that's worthy of an answer, of a response. But yeah, that's not my wheelhouse.
Not your wheelhouse. Okay, cool. Thank you for letting us know that. Okay, couple of other things, and I'm going to see if Dr. Lynn has anything to add. I'm going to scroll through the chat. I know there was a few questions about, someone had a question about the Holocaust. I know you mentioned something in the beginning.
About how it's a form of cultural trauma.
Yes. And then someone said which Holocaust, and I think you were just mentioning reference to all.
Oh, yeah, it can be any Holocaust.
Okay, so that answers that question. Yes. Does anybody else have any other questions that you can see or think of now that you would like to post in the Q&A? I'm just going to wait just a second. Someone posted a cool link in the chat too. Oh, the slides available after the presentation. That's one of the questions. Will they be available? There will be a recording that is available to access in our CTL webinar section. And I can post that link in the chat as well too. I will do that now. Let's see, anybody else have any questions? And then while we wait for that, we'll see if Dr. Lynn has anything else to add. Wait for her to come on.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm still scrolling through the chat because there was also a lot of resources. Yeah, there was a lot posted in there. Thank you so much for people's thoughts and sharing of ideas. Therese, those are great questions. And I was actually reading part of the chart and missed part of what you were asking when you first started speaking. So I apologize for that. And I'm happy to connect with you via email. I will put my email in the chat afterwards. I have been a course writer for SEL here at NCU. And I don't know if you took a course here, if you're referring somewhere else, but I will say, you know, and Christy, correct me if I'm wrong, because you, I think, were an editor on those courses. My honest opinion is I think our courses are pretty good. But I also feel as a course writer, I could have gone further with the diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice components. I think that a lot has opened my eyes and probably the eyes of many people in the past couple of years. And those courses were written a little bit before that. So I don't know, Christy, would you say that that is true? I mean, I think, yeah, we can do better. We can always.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And because, and I guess a lot of it has to do with the development life cycle. By the time courses get to me, they've been through several people. So that's why I'm always suggesting that a lot be done more at the beginning. So now by me presenting this information, it's an opportunity for people to become more receptive and learn more about the whole concept of cultural responsive and empathy and just basic. I mean, there's a lot of content that you can use to guide you in the APA manual. The 7th edition has a whole section devoted to bias-free language. So just starting at the basics, I think you go a long way when people know that you see them. See them meaning you see them in terms of the way you write in your content, that you're not diminishing them or ignoring them. So it goes a long way. So I don't think any of the things that are done are necessarily intentional, but once that has been brought to your attention, my dad used to say, when you know better, you're supposed to do better. So now that I brought it to your attention, you shouldn't see course content that has, erroneous things as saying that somebody's perception of something is wrong. It's my perception, so how can it be wrong? You can put something in the content to address other issues, but to write content in a fashion that dismisses your student body, I think it begs the question, so I'm paying you to disrespect me. That's how I view it when I'm reading, because I look at what I do as reading from the student's perspective. And they're paying funds to get them to take them to another level. So the least that we can do is try to bring their experiences to the table in terms of, so how does this affect you? Whether it's in education, whether it's in technology, whether it's in nursing, psychology, what are we doing to make sure that we've covered different pieces of information, different experts that are out there that may not necessarily be, mainstream, but it's legitimate information. To me, that goes a long way.
And Christy, thank you so much for sharing that. I do have a couple of questions. Negus asked, is there a template for culturally responsive curriculum?
Can you repeat the question?
No problem. Is there a template for culturally responsive curriculum? Is there an actual template for it that you're aware of?
No.
All right.
All I've seen during the course of my research, all I saw, and it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but during the course of my research, all I saw were strategies and guidelines. But I think that's great, because there's nothing preventing us from creating a culturally responsive template, because it's just what I just mentioned. A culturally responsive template can be something that you acknowledge from the beginning of your course to the end. You're acknowledging different experiences. You're acknowledging different learning patterns that people have. And so there are a lot of different ways that you can go into, because I would be hard pressed to say that one thing can work for one student, one university, and it needs to be flexible so that you can navigate it and take it to all disciplines.
Thank you so much. And this chat question, I think it's important to talk about it. Tim mentions, you talked about the importance of empathy between faculty and student and interaction among students. Any tips on how to promote empathy in an entirely asynchronous course?
I know it's a challenge, but if you have any opportunity to, because I realize this is one-to-one. I realize that. So, but if there's a creative way to do it, and of course, everything that is there, it may not necessarily fit NCU, but NCU, NU, we're constantly changing. So you can put information out there on the horizon and see what happens. But yeah, I agree that you have to make adjustments. But if there's an opportunity because out in the commons, don't we interact? We encourage students to interact in the commons. Mm-hmm. And there are a set of rules in terms of how they should interact with each other. Mm-hmm. So, and I've seen a few courses where they utilize the commons. So I think, and I know they have different groups. So I think there's a way, but we have to be able to just kind of stretch our minds, because I know this is difficult, because a lot of times I'll get pushback like, you're just an editor. Well, I absorb words and read words like your students will be absorbing and reading words. So if I pick up on certain messages, perhaps you should acknowledge that, because I'm never going to, my due diligence is to do what I pick up on in the course of your content. I point it out. Now, what you do with the information after that is strictly up to you. But I think you owe your students that much to at least try.
And I want to say something about that, Christy, because we've had a difficult conversation. That's how we first met face to face. So Christy was behind the scenes doing work here at NCU, and was brave enough to, I think it takes bravery, to really speak up about how something struck her. And it opened the door for us to have a really honest conversation about our lived experiences and how we were developing this course. So honestly, I see Christy as absolutely instrumental to have on my team, to be on her team, and to work together in this way, because there's no way that I have to be honest, right? There's no way that I can see every single blind spot that I have. That's just simply not possible. But I do know what my heart says when I write a course. I know what's in my heart and mind. I know what I want to convey. So it's so important to have a diverse team that can help hold me accountable to that as I'm writing a course and help me to stretch my own thinking. And Christy has done that. it eases my mind to know that she is behind the scenes doing that work and will reach out to me to have an honest conversation.
Thank you for that. A few people are saying, thank you so much for the information. Collaborative effort is important. I don't want to put you on the spot here, Christy, but do you have a favorite book that you would recommend on this topic?
Favorite book? Well, not necessarily on this topic, but this book kind of brings you full circle.
Okay.
It's Cast. I can't remember the author's name right now, but it's called Cast.
Okay.
C-A-S-T-E.
All right. Thank you so much. Everybody go Google it. Let me see a couple more questions.
Mhm.
And I also saw someone had their hand raised too, and I think Jennifer just popped her question in the Q&A. So, can behavioral assessment help with cultural responsive template design?
Behavioral. I have no idea. That's a good question.
Okay, fair.
I have no idea.
I will keep moving then. How can we start to incorporating this into our coursework? What are some of the things that they can start putting?
What they can start doing? Start early enough during your, whether it's development or it's a full revision, start early enough with your team in terms of identifying pockets. Pockets meaning, okay, especially I'll start with a revision, because if the course is already there, then that gives you a starting point. If you've received, I know they do the student surveys. Did you receive any comments? I'm sorry. Did you receive any comments from students that said that they didn't understand something, or they found something offensive, or something they felt was left out? That's a good starting place. Start there with the information that you get back from there, and then work to broaden the amount of information from experts that may not necessarily be standard. I mean, to me, that's important. You shouldn't have experts from one school, one field of thought. I mean, just broaden your horizons if you can. And in terms of a brand new course, just again, be open-minded. And then it'll allow time to go through the development process so that by the time I receive it, I'm not scratching my head wondering why did somebody just throw a picture of diverse people in here and think that's diversity, equity, inclusion? You know, or throw a few words around, because sometimes I have seen that. And it's kind of a head scratcher to me, because that's not diversity, equity, inclusion. I know with some of the courses, it can be mind-boggling to try to do that, especially when you start talking about research courses, but I still think there's a way. If there's nothing but saying that your research group should be diverse, that's something. I mean, but I just say, look at it from your student standpoint. Do you know who your students are? Do you know what they're experiencing? And no, I realize you may not be in email contact with your students, but if they're not responding or they're not doing their assignments, do you even wonder why that's occurring?
Thank you, Christy. I am going to go ahead and let Jennifer talk, because she does have a great question in the Q&A.
Okay.
Jennifer, are you able to unmute yourself?
Did it work? Did I unmute myself?
You did it.
Okay. Actually, this just is I'm trying to connect all of these presentations because I believe they are all connected. And I've spoken with a couple people from different organizations that promote different types of inclusive practices in terms of teacher education. And so my question was really about, kind of rhetorical, because I think I know the answer already, but given my conversations, but I really honestly believe that if you're going to implement any kind of teacher social learning, there's no way to divorce it from culturally responsive teaching, restorative justice practices, social justice and equity, trauma-informed practices, disability inclusion practices. Can you really, truly implement one without realizing that all the others are just as relevant and necessary? And I want to make a comment about the behavioral assessment. I put in the Q&A, it really depends on which and whose context you are using to assess the behaviors. Unfortunately, behaviors are, standards for behaviors are not the same across all cultures, across all contexts. And I think a lot of behavioral assessment that occurs in education, unfortunately, is standardized based on the current white European standardized cultural practices that we find acceptable in the institution of K-12 education. And those are not always accurate representations of the cultural and socio-political and all the various contexts these students live within and have to deal with. So I think how we assess behavior actually needs to be adjusted, seriously adjusted, to take into all of these, to take into account all of these contexts our students are dealing with. So anyway, that's kind of just the comment I wanted to make. And I also wanted to say thank you very much, because this is a topic that really needs to be put to the forefront in our educational field. So appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. And I appreciate your comments about making, you can't do one without doing the other. It has to be all inclusive. So that was awesome.
Thank you.
I will just add the way that we're, I agree, Jennifer, it all goes together, it all links together. I also respect Teresa in the chat. I don't want to ignore saying she has a different view of behavioral assessment. I think that's fair. I know there's many different views. But I want to say the umbrella that we're putting them under, and Christy will be there, is our October 7th micro conference, Going Beyond the Surface with Relationship Building and Online Education. So I hope that people will join us for that. We will have a panel, 2 panels with our Ed Break experts, as well as several different faculty presenters.
Absolutely. I just saw one more thing in the chat, so sorry for my pause. Assessments are also sometimes made to accommodate the school system rather than the students and their families. An interesting comment, Shirley. And any thoughts on that?
Yes, because assessments is just, for me, a continuation of what you see in terms of the content. It's a continuation. So absolutely, the same standards in terms of cultural responsiveness and empathy should be addressed when you come to assessments and assignments in general, but definitely assessments. You're essentially critiquing how you think a person absorbs information based on whatever standards you've set up. And if they only are created to address one type of student, then there's a whole group of students that you're not addressing. So yeah, assessments are definitely important too.
Thank you so much, Christy, for that. And I do want to just thank all the attendees for participating in the chat and adding comments and questions. And if there isn't anything else, Dr. Lynn or Christy.
Thank you all. I appreciate your participation, the time you took from your day to come learn about this topic. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And more to come for the micro conference, correct?
Yes.
All right. All right. Well, until then, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.